Eleanor Voss was still holding the inkwell when her father told her she had been sold. The library smelled of damp paper and last winter's ash, and through the tall window behind him, rain struck the leaded glass in uneven bursts, like someone knocking who knew they would not be let in. She set the inkwell down. She did not spill a drop. Her father's hands were folded on the desk in a posture she recognized. The posture of a man who had already made the decision and was only now constructing the explanation. Baron Aldous Voss had the look of someone who had been slowly swallowed by water and had only just noticed. The creditors had come twice in the past month. The third time, apparently, he had opened the door himself. The Duke of Wrentham, he said, had agreed to absorb the full liability. Eleanor looked at the rain. In exchange for what? She said. He did not answer immediately. The silence was its own answer. She had managed her father's accounts for 6 years, not officially. A baron's daughter did not manage accounts. She arranged flowers and read improving literature and made herself agreeable to the sort of men who would one day agree to take her off her father's hands. But Eleanor had never been particularly agreeable, and the flowers she arranged had always died, and the improving literature had given her the rather inconvenient habit of noticing when numbers did not match. She had noticed 3 years ago that her father's numbers had stopped matching in a very serious way. She had corrected what she could. She had not been able to correct his taste for hazard tables. £14,000. That was the figure he finally spoke. £14,000 in creditor debt, accumulated across 19 months, which the Duke of Wrentham had agreed to absorb in full in exchange for the hand of Eleanor Voss in a formal marriage of arrangement, effective the following Friday. She did not cry. She had learned, somewhere between the ages of 14 and 22, that crying in front of her father produced nothing useful. She stood. She walked to the window. She pressed one hand flat against the cold glass, and the rain drummed against her fingers through the pane, and she thought, "I will survive this. I will not break." "What do you know about the Duke?" she said. "He is solvent," her father said, as if solvency were a personality. "What do you know about his character?" she said. Another silence, shorter this time. "He's not known for cruelty," her father said. "Not known for cruelty." Eleanor would spend the next 14 days trying to decide whether that was reassurance or warning. She turned from the window. Her father had not looked at her once since he had delivered his news, though he had not used the word sold. He had used other words: arrangement, convenience, prudent. She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had signed her name onto a document she had never seen, as payment for a debt she had not made. "Very well," she said. She walked out of the library. She did not slam the door. Her hands were shaking. She did not let her father see. She would not understand until much later that the composure she wore into Wrentham Hall like armor was the same armor that would make the Duke believe she had nothing inside worth protecting. So the carriage arrived at Wrentham Hall on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks before Christmas, and the first thing Eleanor noticed was that the gates needed rehanging. She had not meant to notice. She had meant to observe the estate with the careful neutrality of a woman who had accepted her circumstances and intended to navigate them efficiently. But the left gate post leaned at a 5-degree angle, and the iron hinge had been repaired badly with the wrong gauge of bolt, and she had spent enough years managing a household in quiet disrepair to recognize the specific vocabulary of neglect. Wrentham Hall was not poor. It was ignored. There was a difference, and she filed it away without knowing why. The staff assembled at the entrance numbered 12. Their livery was correct, their posture formal. Their faces told a different story. The housekeeper, a woman of perhaps 60 with gray eyes and the bearing of someone who had been steadying things for a long time, stepped forward and introduced herself as Mrs. Hartley. She took Eleanor's cloak with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had handled difficult arrivals before. Eleanor liked her immediately, which she recognized was probably not useful. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice. He had not spoken. It was the quality of stillness that entered the entrance hall a half-second before he did. A particular silence that displaced the ordinary sounds of the house. The fires crackling, a door closing somewhere above, the nervous shuffle of a footman near the stair. The air changed. That was the only way Eleanor could describe it later to herself, in private. The air in the room rearranged itself to accommodate him, and every person in it became slightly more careful about where they put their hands. Aldrich Cavendish, Duke of Wrentham, was not what she had prepared herself for. She had prepared for cold. She received it. But she had prepared for a kind of deliberate, performative cold. The coldness of a man who wished you to know he was unmoved. What she received instead was indifference of a more complete variety. He looked at her the way he might look at new furniture, assessing utility, registering the acquisition, moving on. His gaze swept her once and arrived not at her face but at the ledger she was carrying under her arm. Something shifted at the corner of his eye. Not warmth, attention. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," she said. He turned and walked toward the east corridor. She was expected to follow. She did. The meeting that followed lasted 40 minutes and took place in a receiving room that smelled of beeswax and old smoke, and a third scent Eleanor could not immediately name. Something mineral and faintly chemical, like iron filings or the inside of a very old clock. The Duke sat across from her at a distance, calibrated to discourage anything resembling intimacy. A solicitor was present. There were documents. Eleanor read every line. The solicitor looked surprised that she read them. The Duke did not look surprised. He looked, for a fraction of a second, as if he had expected it and had chosen not to remark on it, which was not the same thing as indifference. She signed. The solicitor gathered the papers. The Duke stood. "Mrs. Hartley will show you to your rooms," he said. "The household accounts are managed by my steward, Hargrove. You will not need to concern yourself with them." "Of course," Eleanor said. She did not argue. She did not offer an alternative. She simply looked at him with the expression of a woman who has accepted an instruction while quietly deciding something else entirely. The Duke's eyes moved to her face one final time. She had the distinct and unnerving sense that he had noticed. She had the equally distinct sense that he did not intend to do anything about it. Mrs. Hartley was waiting in the corridor. Eleanor followed her toward the east staircase, and as she walked, she heard the Duke say something to the solicitor in a low voice she was not meant to hear. 2 words, nothing more, the second of which was useful. She filed that away too. She was developing quite a file. She found the error in the household accounts on her 17th day at Wrentham Hall. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking at the coal supply records, which Mrs. Hartley had mentioned, in a tone of studied neutrality, were slightly inconsistent. Eleanor had asked to see the records in a tone of equally studied neutrality, and Mrs. Hartley had produced them without comment, which Eleanor understood to be a form of trust she had not yet earned, and therefore valued more than any kindness offered freely. The coal records were inconsistent. They were also not the only inconsistency. The figures Hargrove presented in the weekly household summaries did not reconcile with the delivery receipts Eleanor found filed in the wrong drawer of the estate's secondary ledger room, a small, cold space off the kitchen corridor that Hargrove apparently did not consider worth locking. She sat with the numbers for 3 evenings by the light of a single lamp, her breath fogging the air, and at the end of the 3rd evening, she had a figure. It was not a small figure. Someone had been taking money from this estate for at least 3 years. She did not go to the Duke, not yet. She did not know enough, and she had learned, through long practice, that the difference between a suspicion and an argument was documentation. In the meantime, she learned the estate. Wrentham Hall was not what it appeared from the drive. It was older than its facade suggested, with a Tudor core buried inside the Palladian renovations, and it had the specific character of a building that had been managed in decades-long cycles of attention and neglect. The east wing roof was sound. The west wing roof was not. The kitchen garden had been abandoned for 2 growing seasons, and the soil in the lower beds had compacted into something close to clay. The rose garden behind the south terrace was a tangle of unpruned canes 3 feet above the wall, thorns catching the December light like copper wire. She began with the kitchen garden. Not because it was the most important problem, but because it was the most immediate, and because the cook, a man named Paris, had looked at her once with the expression of someone who had been disappointed so often that hope had become painful. She asked him what he needed. He told her. She arranged it quietly, through channels that did not require Hargrove's approval or the Duke's attention. She did not ask permission. She simply began. The staff noticed. They did not speak of it directly, but the household shifted around her with a different quality. Not deference exactly, but a kind of watchful recalibration. Mrs. Hartley began leaving small notes under her door. The stable master, a taciturn man named Greer, started touching his cap when she passed rather than looking through her. The Duke, as far as Eleanor could determine, noticed none of this. He was present in the hall, the way weather was present. You were aware of the conditions, but you did not expect to have a conversation with them. He took his meals separately. He spent his mornings in the north wing study, the one room in the house with a locked door that had never, according to Mrs. Hartley, been opened in the 3 years she had managed the household. He rode in the late afternoon, alone, across the lower fields in the direction of the chalk ridge, and came back an hour before dark with the particular look of a man who had been somewhere the rest of the world was not invited. It was in the 6th week that she saw it. She had been crossing the stable yard at dusk, returning from the kitchen garden, when she heard the sound of a child crying. One of the stable master's grandchildren, a girl of perhaps 5, had caught her sleeve on a hinge and torn a long gash in the cloth, and was sitting on the mounting block in the particular distress that is slightly out of proportion to the damage, in the way that distress often is when the child is cold and tired, and the torn sleeve is merely the thing that finally makes crying permissible. The Duke was there before Eleanor was. He had come around the far corner of the stable building on his way back from his ride, and he had stopped. He looked at the child for a moment. He looked, once, in the direction of the hall, as if checking whether he was being observed. He was not, as far as he could see. He dismounted without handing the reins to anyone. He crouched down to the level of the mounting block. He said something Eleanor could not hear. The child looked up at him with the expression of a small person deciding whether to trust a large one, and then she nodded, and he produced a handkerchief from his coat pocket and handed it over with the awkward precision of a man who was not accustomed to the gesture but understood its necessity. He stood. He noticed Eleanor. The expression that crossed his face lasted less than 2 seconds. It was not embarrassment. It was the expression of a man who had been seen doing something he believed made him legible, and who did not want to be legible. He handed his horse's reins to the stable boy who had appeared and walked past Eleanor without speaking. His shoulder passed within a foot of hers. She felt the cold that came off him like a second garment. She looked at the mounting block. The child was wiping her face with the handkerchief, which bore, in the corner, a small embroidered letter A. Eleanor looked at the locked door of the north wing. She thought about 3 years of ledger discrepancies. She thought about the moment in the entrance hall, when he had looked not at her face but at the ledger under her arm. She thought about the specific quality of loneliness that lived in the rooms of Wrentham Hall, like cold in old stone. Not recent, not accidental. Earned. She went inside. She picked up the ledger she had been building in secret, page by careful page, for 4 weeks. She added 3 more entries. Then she sat for a long moment in the dark of her small sitting room, her pen dry, her hands very still. And for the first time since she had arrived at this house, she allowed herself to feel something she had not budgeted for. On the 43rd day of her marriage, Eleanor finished the documentation. £1,100. It extracted over 38 months across 11 separate line items in the estate accounts, each discrepancy individually small enough to disappear into the noise of a large household's expenses, collectively large enough to matter. Hargrove had been careful. He was not, however, careful with the delivery receipts, which he had not filed personally, and which a woman paying attention to the wrong drawer could find. Eleanor had found them all. She dressed that morning with the particular care of a person preparing for a difficult conversation. She could not afford to appear uncertain. She picked up the ledger. She walked to the north wing. The study door was closed but not locked. She had not expected that. She raised her hand to knock, and through the door she heard voices. The Duke's, low and controlled, and Hargrove's, with its particular quality of deference that she had always found slightly wrong, the way a note slightly off pitch was wrong. Not obvious, but persistent. She should have knocked. She should have announced herself. She stood with her hand raised and did not knock, because something in the timbre of the Duke's voice had changed, had taken on the quality of a man saying something he had decided in advance. And she had been in this position before, outside a door, learning more than she was meant to, and she had never yet walked away. "She is a convenience," the Duke said. The words were clear and level, nothing more. "Once the estate revenues are restored to viability, the arrangement will be dissolved. You have my word on that." Hargrove said something she could not hear. "Her presence here is temporary," the Duke said. "She is useful in the way any competent person is useful. That is the full extent of my interest." Eleanor lowered her hand. She stood in the corridor for a very long moment. The cold stone of the wall was at her back, and the ledger was in her arms, and through the door she heard the conversation continue, but she was no longer listening to it. She was listening to something else. The specific internal sound of a thing she had not known she was building coming apart. She had not built hope here. She had been too careful for hope. But there had been something, some small accumulation of careful mornings and stable yards and unlocked doors that she had apparently been foolish enough to let grow without naming it. And now, she was naming it too late. She walked back to her sitting room. She set the ledger on the desk. She sat down and placed her hands flat on the surface and looked at the fire for a long time. He intended to dissolve the marriage. He had told Hargrove, the man who was stealing from him, which meant either he did not know about Hargrove or he did not care. She did not yet know which was worse. She picked up her pen. She could leave the ledger on her desk. She could say nothing. She could allow the estate to continue bleeding quietly while the Duke planned his convenient dissolution and never thought to ask what she had been doing in that cold ledger room for 6 weeks. She could survive that. She was good at surviving. She thought about Mrs. Hartley, whose authority had been quietly undermined by Hargrove's financial control for 3 years. She thought about Paris the cook, whose kitchen garden was finally, tentatively beginning to revive. She thought about a child on a mounting block and a handkerchief with the letter A, and a man who had looked at her with a ledger under her arm and had not been surprised. She was going to give him the documentation, not because she forgave the words she had heard, not because she expected anything from him, but because there were £1,100 missing from an estate that 8 people depended on for their livelihoods, and she could not allow that to continue for the sake of her own wounded pride. She rewrote the summary page. She made it precise and complete and entirely unarguable. She sealed it with wax, using the small plain seal she had brought from her father's house, and she addressed it to the Duke in the hand she used for formal correspondence. Clear and unadorned, giving nothing away. She called for a footman. She asked him to deliver it to the North Wing study. Then she sat back and looked at the fire, and the anger she felt was clean and cold and perfectly structured, like a room that had been emptied of everything it did not need. She was no longer the woman who had arrived at Wrentham Hall 17 days after her own sale. She was not entirely sure yet what she was instead, but she was quite certain that she would not be dissolved at his convenience. She did not see the Duke for 4 days after she sent the ledger. She heard, through Mrs. Hartley, that Hargrove had been dismissed on the first day. She heard, through Greer, the stable-master, who was not a man given to unnecessary speech, that 2 solicitors had arrived on the second day and departed on the third with a sealed case. She continued her work. She managed the household with the quiet, systematic attention she had been giving it for 6 weeks, and she gave no indication to anyone that she was waiting for anything. On the 4th day, he came to her. She was in the kitchen garden, in the early cold of a December afternoon, showing Paris the revised layout for the spring beds. She heard his footstep on the gravel path, and knew it was him before she looked up. Not from any particular intimacy with the sound of him, but because the garden, like every space he entered, rearranged itself slightly. She kept her eyes on the layout. "Miss Voss," he said. "I am Lady Wrentham," she said without looking up. "Unless there is paperwork I have not been shown." A silence, short, but not comfortable. "Lady Wrentham," he said. She looked up then, as he was standing at the entrance of the kitchen garden, with his hands behind his back and his expression entirely controlled, and she recognized that expression. It was the expression he used when he was working very hard to appear as though he required nothing. She had seen it in the entrance hall. She had seen it in the receiving room. She was quite tired of it. "The ledger," he said, "was accurate," she said, "to the penny." "How long?" he said. 6 weeks of documentation," she said. "The discrepancies themselves go back at least 38 months, possibly longer, though I could only verify what was contained in the hall's own records." She folded the layout. She faced him fully. "You had told me not to concern myself with the accounts. I concerned myself anyway. I suspect you will consider that a trespass." He was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the kitchen garden held its stripped winter stillness. Bare beds and cold earth and the smell of turned soil, which was the smell, Eleanor thought, of things that were capable of growth, but had not yet been asked to. "It was not a trespass," he said. The words cost him something. She could hear that they cost him. She waited. "I owe you," he began. "I heard you," she said, 4 days ago, in the corridor outside the North Wing study. I heard what you told Hargrove." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before it. It had weight. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of the space he's standing in. "A convenience," she said, "nothing more. To be dissolved at your discretion." He said nothing. She continued. "I have not come to this estate asking for anything I was not contractually offered. I have not asked for your regard, or your warmth, or your honesty, and I have not expected them, because you were very clear from the first day of our arrangement about the terms of your interest. But I will tell you something clearly, so that there is no ambiguity between us." She looked at him steadily. Her voice did not shake. She had decided it would not, and she was a woman who kept her decisions. "I gave you £1,100 of recovered revenue and 6 weeks of work that you did not ask for. I did it not for your gratitude and not for my own advantage. I did it because this estate employs 8 people who did not deserve to be stolen from, and because I am not in the habit of allowing preventable harm to continue simply because addressing it is inconvenient for me." She paused. "You may dissolve this arrangement whenever you choose. That is your legal right, and I will not contest it. but you should know what you are dissolving." He did not speak for a long time. The December afternoon was failing around them, compressing itself toward dark, and he stood at the entrance of the kitchen garden with his hands still behind his back and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not warmth, not anger, but something rawer than either. Something that looked, she thought, like recognition. He moved then, not toward her, but to the low stone wall at the garden's edge, and he lowered himself onto it. Not gracefully, not with the controlled precision he brought to every other physical act, but simply. He sat on the wall of the kitchen garden in his coat and looked at the bare earth and was, for the first time in Eleanor's experience of him, entirely without posture. "My first steward," he said to the earth, "was dismissed for the same thing 7 years ago." His voice had changed. The controlled quality was still there, but something beneath the control was audible now, the way you could hear the stone beneath shallow water when the light was right. The one before Hargrove lasted 8 months. I believed, for reasons I now understand were not reasons but wishes, that loyalty could be constructed through financial incentive. A pause. I was incorrect. Eleanor waited. "I have been incorrect about a number of things," he said, "since you arrived." She looked at him, sitting on her kitchen garden wall in the failing light. This man who ran cold in every room he entered. And she felt something she had been carefully not feeling for 6 weeks settle into her chest with the particular weight of something true. "The locked study," she said. "The north wing. What is in it?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he would not answer. "My mother's correspondence," he said finally. "The letters she sent to my father's solicitor over a period of 9 years, arranging the transfer of roughly 1/3 of the Wrentham estate assets into accounts held in her name." He stopped. "She left when I was 14. She took the letters with her. She did not take the copies." Eleanor sat down on the wall beside him. Not close, a foot of winter air between them. But she sat, and she did not fill the silence with comfort or sympathy or any of the other things people offered when they did not know what else to give. She sat with him in the dark of it. After a long time, he said very quietly, "I told Hargrove what I told him, because I was afraid." "I know," Eleanor said. "Not of you," he said quickly. Then, slower, "of what it meant that I had been watching you for 6 weeks and finding reasons to be in the rooms you had already been in." Eleanor looked at the bare beds of the kitchen garden. She thought about the handkerchief with the letter A. She thought about 3 years of a locked door and a Duke who ran cold through every room and had still, without any audience at all, crouched down to a crying child's level and offered what he had. "I do not want to be dissolved," she said. It was not a plea. It was a statement of position, delivered in the same voice she used for account summaries. "I want to stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go, though that is also true. Because I have looked at this estate, and I can see what it could be. And because I have looked at you, and I can see what you could be. And I am not willing to leave that unfinished." He looked at her. The last light was leaving the garden, and his face was partly in shadow, but she saw his hands on his knees, the tension in them, and then the deliberate, conscious release of that tension. He moved off the wall. He did not stand. He went down onto one knee in the bare earth of the kitchen garden. Not to propose, they were already married, but in a gesture she understood without needing it, explained. He was making himself the same height as what he was asking forgiveness for. "I cannot promise to be what I am not," he said. "I can promise to stop pretending that what I am is less than what I have shown you in the past 6 weeks." Eleanor looked down at him. She thought about £14,000 and a gate with the wrong gauge of bolt, and a man who had not asked her what she was capable of before deciding she was merely useful. "Forgiveness," she said, "is not the same as trust. You understand that?" "Yes," he said. "Then we will begin," she said, "from here." She held out her hand, not a romantic gesture, a contractual one, the same kind she had offered in the receiving room on the first day. But his hand, when it took hers, was not cold. It took 3 months. Not for the love. That had been building in the kitchen garden and the ledger room and the stable yard for longer than either of them had been willing to name. 3 months for the trust, which was a different and more demanding thing. He gave her the household accounts on the 1st of January, formally, in writing, with a letter that said only that her management of the estate's interests had demonstrated a capacity the previous arrangement had failed to recognize. He did not perform the gesture. He simply did it, and when she read the letter, she understood that the absence of performance was itself the point. He was not making a speech. He was changing a fact. Hargrove, she learned through the solicitor's correspondence that now crossed her desk as well as the Duke's, had been referred for prosecution on the 2nd day after her ledger arrived. So she had not asked for this. He had done it without consulting her, which she noted, and did not immediately decide how to feel about. And then she noted that he had also written personally to Mrs. Hartley with an acknowledgement that her household management had been systematically undermined for 3 years, and that this would not recur. She found Mrs. Hartley in the kitchen corridor the morning after that letter arrived. The older woman's eyes were dry, but her hands, Eleanor noticed, had stopped their habitual tension. Lady Cecily Marchworth arrived at Wrentham Hall on the 22nd of February without an invitation. Eleanor was in the library when the carriage was announced. She did not know, at that moment, who Cecily Marchworth was. She learned within the hour from Mrs. Hartley's careful and neutral face and 6 compressed words, the woman the Duke had once been engaged to. She came in on a cold afternoon in a traveling dress of considerable elegance, and with the specific expression of a woman who had calculated her return and found the timing favorable. She was beautiful in the way that certain things are beautiful. Deliberately, strategically, as a primary function. She looked at Eleanor in the entrance hall with a smile that expressed very precisely the opinion that Eleanor was an interim measure. Eleanor showed her to a receiving room. She asked for tea. She was, in every external respect, entirely composed. The Duke's face, when he entered, did not change. Eleanor had become quite good over 3 months at reading the things that lived behind his expressions, and what she read was not longing or the resurgence of old feeling. It was the particular cold weariness of a man confronting something he had already survived and had no interest in surviving again. "Cecily," he said. She had a speech. Eleanor heard the first few sentences of it. Something about misunderstandings, about time, about how she had perhaps been hasty. Before, the Duke turned to Eleanor with an expression that was not cold at all. "My wife," he said to Cecily, "manages the Wrentham estate accounts." He said it the way he might state a fact about the architecture. Simply and permanently. "She has done so for 14 weeks, with greater competence than anyone I have employed in 11 years. He paused. "She stays. You do not." Cecily left within the hour. Eleanor was in the library when she heard the carriage depart. She was holding a book she had not been reading. She heard his footstep in the corridor. She knew it by now, its particular rhythm, the slight pause before he opened a door that told her he was checking whether the room was occupied before he entered. A habit she had stopped finding strange because she had come to understand it as the habit of a man who had learned not to presume he was welcome anywhere. He opened the library door. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire was going, and the room smelled of old paper and the pine resin from the east window frame she had asked Greer to repair the week before. "You did not need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I did it anyway." She looked back at her book. She heard him cross to the opposite chair and sit. She heard him pick up, after a moment, the treatise on land drainage she had left on the table, which he had been working through with her, chapter by chapter, for 3 weeks, arguing about the section on subsoil composition with the specific intensity of a man who had discovered, to his evident surprise, that he enjoyed arguing with someone who argued well. They sat on opposite sides of the fire for an hour, reading, not speaking much, and the quiet between them was the kind of quiet that is not empty. That spring, the kitchen garden came back. It was Paris who told Eleanor first, on a morning in April, that the lower beds had broken through. She went out before breakfast to look, and the beds that had been clay-hard and empty in December were producing the first pale green evidence that the soil had forgiven 6 years of neglect. She crouched down at the edge of the bed with her fingers in the earth, and she felt rather than heard him arrive behind her. He crouched beside her, in his coat, without regard for his trousers. He looked at the green. "The drainage system worked," she said. "So it appears," he said. He looked at her. She looked at the bed. After a moment, she felt his hand, briefly, over hers in the dark earth. Not a gesture for anyone else. Just that. By midsummer, Wrentham Hall had acquired the particular quality of a house that has been remembered. The west wing roof was repaired. The gatepost was correctly rehung with the right gauge of bolt, which she had sourced herself from the ironworks in the village, after determining that the estate's regular supplier had been charging a 17% premium for inferior materials. She had mentioned this to the Duke in a tone of mild information. He had looked at her for a long moment, with the expression she had come to understand was his version of undisguised delight. The study in the north wing was unlocked for the first time in 3 years. Not by him, but by her, on the morning he set the key on her writing desk, without comment. She went alone. She spent 2 hours in that cold room with the letters his mother had written, and she emerged understanding, more completely than before, the precise dimensions of the wound she had been permitted, slowly, to approach. She locked the door behind her. She put the key in her pocket. It was not hers to carry, but she carried it, and he let her. And they did not discuss it, because some things are not resolved through discussion, but through the quiet, daily decision to remain. Eleanor Voss had arrived at Wrentham Hall, believing she had been sold as payment for a debt she had not made. She had been right about that. She had been wrong about what it meant. The afternoon light fell across the rose garden in August, and she stood at the south terrace with soil on her hands and her sleeves rolled to the elbow. And she heard his step on the flagstone behind her, and she did not turn around. She felt him stop a foot behind her, looking at what she had made of the broken thing he had let go. He set his hand on her shoulder. That was all. The roses, pale and untidy and astonishingly alive, held the late light. She covered his hand with hers. The estate was quiet around them, and she thought, this is what it costs to choose instead of simply endure. This ordinary, improbable afternoon. This